Long before Beyoncé was stacking her money and going fast like a Lambo, there was Mary Ellen Pleasant, a San Francisco silver tycoon. And over a century before investment banker Robert Smith bought the most expensive penthouse in New York, O.W. Gurley was building Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. These early black millionaires are profiled in Shomari Wills' recent book, Black Fortunes, the story of the first 6 African Americans who escaped slavery and became millionaires. He joined us recently to talk about these pioneers and their legacy. Shomari, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's really great to be here.
So if people have heard about early black millionaires, I feel like Madam C.J. Walker is maybe the one that they've heard of because there is still a hair care and cosmetics line that uses her name that's around. But she actually wasn't the first black millionaire. Is that right? So why have people maybe heard about her and not some of the people who came before her?
Well, it's interesting. So Madam C.J. Walker kind of has emerged as sort of an urban legend as the first black millionaire. She was very wealthy, very successful, very important historical figure, but she was predated by a pretty significant amount of folks. I think one of the reasons she emerged as the first black millionaire is she sort of publicized her activities and her wealth and her exploits and her shopping. She actually had a staffed PR person, which was kind of unique for the time.
Smart woman.
Yeah. So she was really the first to kind of push it out there that she was a black millionaire. And she also was one of the first to become a millionaire as the danger of being a black person of wealth was starting to abate. It was very dangerous in the 1800s and at the turn of the century. But as we got closer to the 1920s, got into the late 19 teens, started to be a little bit safer to be a public black figure who had a lot of wealth.
And I know that this is the entirety of your book, so I'll ask you just to, maybe name one or two black millionaires who preceded her, maybe from the 18th century when it was really dangerous.
So, two would be Mary Ellen Pleasant, who became a black millionaire during the gold rush in San Francisco. There weren't a lot of African Americans in the gold rush of the 1840s, 1849 famously, in the 1850s. She went out there and she made money doing a little bit of everything. She had laundromats, she had boarding houses, she invested in silver, she was a moneylender. She just was really diversified and really savvy about money and just built up a very large fortune. And I actually used a lot of that money to help fight against slavery and for women's rights and a lot of great things. Another one most folks haven't heard of is Robert Reed Church. Who was a former slave who escaped during the Civil War, during this famous naval battle, actually. He jumped off the ship and swam in the Mississippi to freedom. And he emerged in Memphis and sort of became one of the big architects of that city and helped build that city up. Famously was the architect of Beale Street. And he was in real estate, he was in entertainment, he was in a little bit of everything, but he was one of the really big builders of Memphis. And as the city rose and became this big, important American city, he shared in that prosperity.
So a lot of the stories that you're telling take place in this era in between the end of slavery and the codification of Jim Crow laws in the South. I'm curious about if you can tell me about the effect that segregation had on black wealth or the ability to accrue black wealth.
One reason it was easier is because it was sort of the, wide open Wild West sort of thing. The country was reorganizing after this big war. A lot of people died. A lot of property was destroyed. So there were a lot of opportunities. At the same time, there was also a lot of opposition to that. But the aid of the government during that time was especially helpful because you had the Freedmen's Bureau, which is a department of the federal government, which was there just to protect African Americans. So a lot of African Americans felt safe in taking risks and building businesses, building big, empires. But at the same time, as time went on, that created resentment. So while it started out, as a wide open opportunity, as time went on, we got more and more resistance. The Ku Klux Klan was simultaneously developed in Memphis and was actually in Tennessee. It was actually a direct response to the black prosperity that was developing in Tennessee.
And Robert Reed Church, in particular, is like a cat with 9 lives, right? Like he escaped like a burning boat. He jumped off another boat and swam to freedom. And then he was shot in the head by a vigilante white mob that didn't like that he was a successful black business owner.
Yeah, so in Memphis in 1866, right after the Civil War, as blacks were building up property and building up businesses really quickly, there was this horrible race riot where the black community was just attacked. The property was burned, people were killed, sexually assaulted. It's terrible. And Robert Reed Church was probably the most well-known black businessman. He had this big, basically a nightclub. And so the mob came after him. They came to his nightclub. They robbed it, drank all the liquor, emptied the till, all that sort of stuff. And then they actually shot him in the head and left him inside his business and lit it on fire, expecting that he would perish. And somehow he escaped and kept going and rebuilt and, helped the African-American community come back from that horrible travesty.
It's amazing. You write about Greenwood, which is a section of Tulsa that was predominantly black, and it became to be known as Black Wall Street. And you mentioned at one point that a black dollar circulated through the community 26 times before it left. So I'm curious about your thoughts about, in an era of segregation, how that allowed black entrepreneurs to grow wealth beyond perhaps what they could have grown if things were integrated.
So yeah, I mean the history of sort of the African American consumer is a history of being neglected. It wasn't really until Coca-Cola and Pepsi came along, and they were some of the first companies to actually market to African Americans, that anyone was really interested in, catering to the black consumer in any sort of meaningful way. Department stores were segregated until the 1950s and 1960s. So there's a long history of people rejecting the African American dollar. What Black Wall Street was, it was basically the north side of Tulsa, Oklahoma, during the early 1900s, around 1901 to around 1920. And so the north side of Tulsa, it was divided by a set of train tracks, was the black section, and the south side was the white section. And basically the blacks on the north side in Tulsa, they called it many things, Greenwood, Black Wall Street. They had this self-contained economy, in part because the business owners on the south side were not interested in catering to them. So Tulsa was this example of how segregation actually, sort of got turned on its head. And African Americans said, well, if you guys don't want our business, you don't want us to come spend money in your establishments, we'll build up our own. And it famously became very prosperous, earning the nickname Black Wall Street.
Right. It was almost like, there was this entire separate but equal social structure and class structure, and some people were on the top. Some people profited from, opening up all of the businesses or buying up properties. And in the case of Greenwood, Tulsa, that man was O.W. Gurley?
Yeah, O.W.
Right?
Gurley.
Tell me a little bit about him.
So O.W. Gurley is a really interesting guy. He was born on Christmas in the year of emancipation in Arkansas. And he's just a really ambitious guy. He's always pursuing whatever he could. He worked for the postal office early on, which was one of the first federal jobs African Americans could have. Became a teacher, and then eventually he started participating in land runs in Oklahoma. So Oklahoma was basically sort of a wide open territory in the late 1880s, 1890s. It was land that had been confiscated from the Native Americans. And the government was basically auctioning off this land through land runs to anybody who could get there and, sort of plant their flag in a plot of land. So he ends up in Oklahoma through the land runs. And then after oil is discovered at the turn of the century in Oklahoma, Tulsa starts becoming a big town. So he actually picked up his life. He was living in kind of the next town over, went to Tulsa, and bought up almost all the land on the north side of the train tracks of Tulsa, which was completely undeveloped, and started to build up kind of this black enclave there.
So he at one point was the majority landowner in Greenwood, correct?
Yeah, so he was basically everybody's landlord. He had, an incredible amount of power. He was almost everybody's landlord. He was also a sheriff's deputy, so he was basically the law and order in Greenwood. Mm-hmm. And he owned, significant plurality of the land, so he was a really powerful guy.
And the end of his wealth, I think, is both tragic and indicative of something you mention in your epilogue about how much of the wealth that was accrued was not intergenerational. It wasn't able to be passed down. And in O.W. Gurley's case, this is because Greenwood was burned down by a racist mob. And so I'm wondering if you can reflect a little bit on the fact that you have these 6 individuals who, for the most part, are entrepreneurs and accrued a great amount of wealth in their own lifetime, and that really after they died, they weren't able to pass that on to children or other descendants.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the through lines of the story for me is that the period after slavery, Reconstruction, and early 1900s was a period where there was a lot of opportunity for people to create wealth as the country was changing, expanding, and healing. But preserving wealth was a whole nother issue. A lot of times African Americans did not have equal status in the courts. That was something that was still being fought for. A lot of times, they had to face so much violence and their lives were so much harder that they didn't necessarily have a giant generational family, so they had no one to leave the land to. So I think, the story to me is about how folks were able to overcome tremendous odds to generate wealth, but they didn't necessarily have the institutions, the courts, they didn't have the large families to be able to preserve it and pass it down.
Mm-hmm. And to me, that's part of why it's so important to talk about the role that race plays in class and in economics, because even if you were one of the few lucky people who was able to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, you were knocked back down again by a mob that came and burned down all of your property.
Right.
You also, half the people who you profiled were women, which I thought was really amazing. It seems remarkable given the gender gap today at the top of the economic ladder. Do you think that it was easier in this time period that you're writing about, the late 19th and early 20th century, to be a successful, wealthy Black woman?
Well, I think it was incredibly hard, to be a successful anything if you were Black during that period.
Right. Good point.
But I think that these women are remarkable. So, I mean, I think that's, that just stands alone. I think one of the things that was interesting was some of the women's dynamics with their husbands, after emancipation there were not necessarily typical gender roles when it came to the workplace. I think African-American women, were able to seize that opportunity and, become, pioneers like Mary Ellen Pleasant and, a lot of the other women I profiled in the book.
Let's talk a little bit about today's landscape. So most of the African-American millionaires and even billionaires who we know of have risen through entertainment or sports. And this is sort of the stereotype or the myth that is presented to many young Black people about how you make money. But most of the people you profiled were entrepreneurs and investors. Were you trying to puncture at all stereotypes about how Black people make money or came into wealth?
I don't think I set out to do that. I mean, I think there's a reason things are structured the way that they are.
Absolutely.
I think entertainment has always been, or, in recent history has been an avenue that African Americans could pursue, entrepreneurially without a tremendous amount of resistance. Whereas finance and, all sorts of other entrepreneurship have been a little bit harder to get into. But, I was pleasantly surprised to see, folks that were in a diverse, array of fields, whether it was real estate development or, manufacturing or, any number of things. They were really a diverse group of entrepreneurs.
And so much of this history has been ignored and lost to time, and I think it is such important work to bring it to the forefront. Many of the people in the book embraced social activism. You had Mary Ellen Pleasant, who bankrolled John Brown, and then Robert Reed Church, you mentioned. He pressured Teddy Roosevelt to invite Booker T. Washington to the White House for dinner. What do you make of the activism, or maybe lack thereof, of today's Black millionaires and billionaires?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times people ask me, like, who today would I compare these folks to? And so, one person, like the first person always comes to mind is Prince, because this was a guy who was giving millions of dollars every year to charity. Nobody even knew until after he died and people started going through his financial documents. I think he was just a guy who did a lot and gave a lot of his wealth to, causes to help African Americans, whether it was, helping African American girls learn to code or just donating to all different types of charities, donating to schools. But he didn't publicize it. A lot of times he was known for telling people, don't say you got this from me.
I'm curious about, there was this very public spat between Harry Belafonte and Jay and Bay. Harry Belafonte said, that one of the great abuses of this modern time is that we should have had such high-profile artists, powerful celebrities, but that they have turned their back on social responsibility. And JayZ, he responded, I believe, sort of angrily, but then later came back and was asked by the Times about it. Do you think black celebrities have a duty to be more vocal? And he said, no, I don't believe in that. The way that people view celebrity is unfair. Everybody should be doing their part because it isn't about money. That doesn't solve it. I'm curious what you think some of, the black activists and entrepreneurs from your book would have to say about that. That it's not about the money. That it's about everybody doing their own personal work of empathy.
Well, I think if you look at what JayZ and Beyonce are doing now, I think they have sort of come around to where, Harry Belafonte was in terms of suggesting that celebrities use their wealth to help. Harry Belafonte is someone who, he used a tremendous amount of his wealth and his celebrity to help Martin Luther King, help the civil rights movement. So he's speaking from experience. I not necessarily speaking about JayZ and Beyonce, but I do think black celebrities in the black wealth class kind of gets off easy in terms of how much that they do contribute to helping, African American causes, economically. There's so much disparity there, and in my opinion, there's not a lot being done to help that, that you would like to see folks with the means recognizing that, really what's going on economically in the African American community is a crisis, and that there needs to be a response just the same way as if there were an earthquake that hit Oakland, right, or that hit any of these, that hit Detroit or hit Flint, we would immediately respond. But there's also an economic crisis going on in these places, in many places of equal magnitude. So I do think that the response is certainly less than it has been in the past.
All right, Shomari, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.